The fence post cracked like a gunshot in the morning silence. I watched 20 years of my life split apart with that weathered wood, knowing this moment would change everything. My calloused hands still gripped the wire cutters as Mr. Henderson's boots crunched across the gravel behind me. "That's it, Miguel. You're done." His voice carried the same coldness I'd heard him use on cattle heading to slaughter. 20 years and you can't even maintain a simple fence line." I turned slowly, feeling the weight of 2 decades pressing against my chest. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Henderson Ranch, the same land where my father had worked, where his father had worked before him. 3 generations of Ramirez sweat had soaked into this Texas soil. "Mr. Henderson, this fence is older than your truck. The wood's rotted through." "Don't make excuses." He stepped closer, his face flushed with the kind of anger that comes from somewhere deeper than a broken fence. "Pack your things. I want you off my property by noon." The words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't about the fence. This was about something else, something I couldn't quite grasp. As I looked around at the rolling pastures, the red barn where I'd spent countless hours, the creek where I'd learned to fish as a boy, I felt a strange mixture of devastation and determination brewing in my chest. I nodded once, turned away from the man who'd just destroyed my world, and began walking toward the small house where 3 generations of my family had called home. But with each step, something was awakening inside me. A need to understand why this felt like more than just losing a job. The silence in my grandfather's old room felt different now, heavier somehow. I'd avoided this space since Abuelo passed 5 years ago, but today, with nowhere else to turn, I found myself sitting on his narrow bed, staring at the wooden chest he'd always kept locked. My hands shook as I pried open the rusty latch. The smell of old paper and cedar filled my nostrils, transporting me back to childhood evenings when Abuelo would tell stories about the old days. Inside, yellowed documents lay stacked like sleeping secrets. The first paper I touched made my breath catch. It was a deed, dated 1952, written in faded ink. But it wasn't just any deed. It was for the Henderson Ranch, and the name at the bottom, in careful cursive, read Eduardo Ramirez, my grandfather's name. I read it again, then a third time, my heart hammering against my ribs. According to this document, my grandfather had owned the Henderson Ranch, not worked on it, owned it. The land where I'd just been fired, where my family had labored for generations, had once belonged to us. My hands trembled as I reached for more papers. There were letters, contracts, and what looked like a bill of sale. Each document painted a picture I'd never imagined, revealing a history that had been buried deeper than any fence post. The afternoon sun slanted through the small window, illuminating dust motes that danced like ghosts of the past. I spread the papers across the bed, trying to piece together a puzzle that seemed impossible. How had we gone from owning the land to working it? What had happened to change everything? As I studied each document, one thing became crystal clear. There was far more to my family's story than I'd ever known. The letter was dated December 15, 1952, written in my grandfather's careful handwriting. As I read, my understanding of everything I thought I knew began to crumble like that morning's fence post. "To my son Carlos," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone. And perhaps it is time you knew the truth about our land." My father's name. This letter had been meant for him, but somehow he'd never found it. Or perhaps he had, and the weight of it had been too much to bear. "I was forced to sell the ranch to Thomas Henderson in 1952. Not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. The bank was going to foreclose, and Thomas offered to buy it with the promise that our family could continue to live and work here. He said it would always be our home." The words blurred as tears I didn't expect began to fall. I wiped my eyes and continued reading. But Thomas's promise came with conditions I didn't understand until it was too late. We could stay, but only as workers. Our ownership, Our legacy would be erased from all records except this one. He said it was temporary, that when times got better he would sell it back. That was 20 years ago, and I know now he never intended to honor his word. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. The Henderson family hadn't just employed us, they'd stolen our birthright and made us grateful for the privilege of working our own land. I kept these papers as proof, hoping someday justice would come. The ranch rightfully belongs to our family, Miguel. If you're reading this, then perhaps that day has finally arrived. The letter was signed with a shaking hand, and below it a simple message: fight for what is ours. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my grandfather's weathered face, heard his voice telling stories I'd thought were just folklore. Now I understood. They weren't stories. They were memories of a life stolen from him. At dawn, I walked to the old oak tree behind the house, the one where Abuelo used to sit and watch the sunrise. Something in his letter had mentioned, "The truth lies where the old oak keeps watch." I'd always thought it was poetic nonsense, but now every word felt deliberate. I circled the massive trunk, running my hands over the bark until I felt something unusual, a small metal box, weathered and partially buried among the roots. My heart raced as I dug it out with my bare hands, dirt caking under my fingernails. Inside the box were photographs. The first showed my grandfather as a young man, standing proudly in front of the ranch house with a beautiful woman I recognized as my grandmother. But it was the second photo that made my knees weak. It showed Thomas Henderson, a much younger version of the man's father, shaking hands with my grandfather. Between them lay papers on a table, and in the background, I could see the ranch that would become their family's empire built on our family's loss. But it was the third photograph that changed everything. It showed the same handshake, but from a different angle. And in this one, I could see something that made my blood run cold. Thomas Henderson was holding a gun, barely visible but clearly pointed at my grandfather under the table. This hadn't been a business transaction. It had been a robbery disguised as a sale, backed by the threat of violence. My grandfather hadn't sold our land. He'd been forced to surrender it at gunpoint. The pieces were falling into place, and with each revelation, my anger grew stronger. Armed with the truth, I drove to the county courthouse, my grandfather's documents clutched in a manila envelope. The elderly clerk, Mrs. Patterson, had worked there for 40 years. If anyone could help me navigate the maze of property records, it would be her. "Miguel Ramirez," she said with a warm smile. "Haven't seen you since your grandfather's funeral. How can I help you today?" I spread the documents across her desk, watching her expression change as she examined each paper. Her eyebrows rose higher with every page, and finally, she looked up at me with something that looked like amazement. "My lord," she whispered, "I remember when these records were sealed. I was just a young clerk then, but I never forgot because it seemed so unusual. Your grandfather came in looking defeated and asked that certain documents be placed in restricted files." Restricted files? Documents that can only be accessed by family members or with a court order. He said someday someone from his family might need to see the truth. She paused, studying my face. "I think that day has come." She disappeared into the back room and returned with a thick folder marked "Confidential, Ramirez Property Dispute, 1952. Inside were copies of everything I'd found, plus additional documents that painted an even clearer picture of what had happened. There were witness statements from neighbors who'd seen Thomas Henderson's men intimidating my grandfather, bank records showing suspicious payments, even a doctor's report documenting injuries my grandfather had sustained during negotiations. "Mrs. Patterson," I said, my voice barely steady, "what would it take to challenge the current ownership of the Henderson Ranch?" She looked at me for a long moment, then smiled. "With evidence like this? A good lawyer and a lot of courage." I had the evidence. Now I needed to find the courage. Rehook moment. 3 days later, I sat across from Sarah Martinez, one of the most respected property lawyers in Texas. She'd spent 2 hours reviewing my grandfather's documents, and her expression had grown more serious with each page. "Miguel," she said finally, "this is one of the most clear-cut cases of property theft I've ever seen. The documentation is extraordinary. Your grandfather was incredibly thorough. So we can get our land back? It's not that simple. 70 years have passed. There are statutes of limitations, adverse possession laws, and the fact that the Henderson family has made significant improvements to the property." She paused, seeing my face fall. "But there's something else here that changes everything." She pulled out a document I hadn't fully understood, a contract addendum dated 6 months after the original sale. This shows that the sale was explicitly temporary, with a buyback clause that was never honored. More importantly, it shows that Thomas Henderson agreed to maintain your family as equal partners in the ranch's profits, not just employees. That agreement was never fulfilled. My heart began to race. "What does that mean?" "It means your family is owed 70 years of profits from a ranch that was supposed to be a partnership, not a sale. We're talking about millions of dollars in compensation, plus the current value of your family's share of the property." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "But Miguel, pursuing this will be a war. The Henderson family has money, influence, and they won't give up without a fight. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about my grandfather's shaking handwriting, about 3 generations of my family working land that should have been ours, about being fired over a fence on property that bore our sweat and blood. "I'm ready," I said. The lawsuit hit the Henderson family like a tornado on a clear day. Within hours of filing, my phone was ringing with calls from reporters, neighbors, and people I hadn't spoken to in years. Word travels fast in a small Texas town, especially when it involves the county's most powerful family. I was loading groceries into my truck when I saw him, James Henderson, the current owner's son, walking toward me with purpose. He'd always been arrogant, but now there was something desperate in his eyes. "Miguel, we need to talk." "I think our lawyers can handle the talking now, James." "Come on, man. We grew up together. You know this is crazy, right? That land has been in our family for 70 years. I turned to face him, feeling a calmness I hadn't expected. "It was in my family for longer than that. Your grandfather stole it at gunpoint." His face flushed red. "That's a lie. My grandfather was a good man. He helped your family when you were about to lose everything. He helped himself to our land and made us grateful for the scraps." I closed my truck door and started to walk away, but his next words stopped me cold. "You have no idea what you're messing with, Miguel. My family has connections. We can make your life very difficult." I turned back slowly, seeing in his face the same entitled cruelty I'd witnessed in his father that morning by the fence. 3 generations of Hendersons, built on a foundation of theft and intimidation. Your family already made my life difficult, James, for 70 years. The difference is, now I know the truth. As I drove away, I saw him in my rearview mirror, phone pressed to his ear, probably calling his father. Let them make their calls. I had something they didn't, the truth and the law on my side. Sarah called me at dawn 3 days later, her voice electric with excitement. "Miguel, you need to get down here immediately. We found something that changes everything." I arrived at her office to find her surrounded by boxes of documents, her hair disheveled and her eyes bright with the look of someone who'd been up all night making discoveries. "I hired a private investigator to dig deeper into the Henderson family's business dealings from the 1950s, she said, pulling out a thick folder. "What we found is incredible. Your grandfather wasn't the only one." She spread out a map of the county, marked with red pins. Between 1950 and 1955, Thomas Henderson acquired 7 different properties using similar tactics. Families in financial distress, forced sales, promises that were never kept. My stomach dropped. 7 families? 7 families who lost their land the same way yours did. And here's the kicker. We found 3 of them. The Morales family, the Johnsons, and the Washingtons. All of them have descendants still living in the area, and all of them have similar documentation hidden away. She handed me a photograph that made my hands shake. It showed Thomas Henderson with a group of men I didn't recognize, standing in front of what looked like a bank. But it was the date stamp that caught my attention. December 1952, the same month my grandfather had been forced to sell. Miguel, this wasn't just theft. This was a systematic land grab, possibly involving bank fraud and definitely involving intimidation and violence. We're not just talking about getting your family's land back. We're talking about exposing one of the biggest property scandals in Texas history. I stared at the map, at all those red pins representing families whose lives had been destroyed by Henderson greed. My grandfather's fight wasn't just about our ranch, it was about justice for an entire community. What do we do now? Sarah smiled grimly. Now we contact the other families. And we make this a class-action lawsuit that will bring down the Henderson empire once and for all. The community center had never felt so charged with electricity. I looked around at the faces gathered in the circle of folding chairs, descendants of the families who'd lost their land to Thomas Henderson's schemes. Maria Morales, whose grandmother had lost a dairy farm. Robert Johnson, whose great-uncle had been forced to sell his cotton fields. Patricia Washington, whose family's horse ranch had been stolen through the same intimidation tactics. Each of them had brought documents, photographs, and stories that had been buried for decades. As we shared our family histories, a pattern emerged that was both heartbreaking and infuriating. My grandmother never talked about the ranch, Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. She just said it was lost to bad men. I found these papers after she died, hidden in her sewing box. Robert nodded grimly. My great-uncle died bitter and angry. He always said the Hendersons were thieves, but nobody believed him. They were too powerful, too respected. Patricia's hands shook as she held up a photograph of her family's horse ranch. Look at this land. Look at what we built. And then look at what happened to us after we sold it. Sarah stood at the front of the room, her laptop connected to a projector showing a timeline of the Henderson acquisitions. What we're looking at here is a coordinated effort to systematically steal land from minority and struggling families. Thomas Henderson used his position at the bank to identify vulnerable properties, then used intimidation and fraud to acquire them for pennies on the dollar. The room fell silent as the magnitude of what we were uncovering sank in. This wasn't just about individual families. This was about a pattern of injustice that had shaped our entire community for 70 years. So, what happens now? Robert asked. Sarah smiled. Now we file the biggest property rights lawsuit this county has ever seen. And we make sure the whole world knows what the Henderson family really built their empire on. The story exploded across Texas like wildfire. Within a week of filing our class action lawsuit, reporters from Dallas, Houston, and Austin were camped outside the courthouse. The headline in the Austin American-Statesman read, 70-Year Land Theft Scandal Rocks East Texas. I found myself thrust into a spotlight I'd never wanted, giving interviews and explaining over and over how my grandfather's hidden documents had uncovered decades of systematic property theft. But with each interview, I felt my grandfather's presence more strongly, as if he was finally getting the chance to tell his story. The Henderson family's response was swift and predictable. They hired the most expensive law firm in Dallas and began a media campaign painting us as opportunists trying to steal land that had been legally purchased decades ago. But their strategy backfired when Patricia Washington's great-aunt, now 93 years old, agreed to be interviewed by Channel 8 News. Sitting in her wheelchair, her voice still strong despite her age, she told the story of watching Thomas Henderson's men burn down her family's barn when they refused to sell. I was just a little girl, she said, her eyes fierce with memory. But I remember the smoke, and I remember my daddy crying. Thomas Henderson told him if he didn't sign those papers, worse things would happen to our family. The interview went viral. Suddenly, the Henderson family's carefully crafted image as pillars of the community began to crumble. More witnesses came forward. Elderly residents who remembered the intimidation tactics, former bank employees who recalled suspicious transactions, even a retired sheriff's deputy who admitted he'd been ordered to look the other way. The pressure was mounting, and I could feel the tide turning. But I also knew the Hendersons wouldn't go down without a fight. The real battle was just beginning. They came for me on a Tuesday morning. I was feeding the chickens behind my small rental house when two sheriff's deputies pulled into my driveway. My heart sank as I recognized the lead officer, Deputy Morrison, whose family had worked for the Hendersons for 3 generations. "Miguel Ramirez, you're under arrest for trespassing and destruction of property." "What?" Morrison held up a warrant. "You're accused of breaking into the Henderson Ranch office and stealing documents. You need to come with us." As they put the handcuffs on, I saw James Henderson's truck parked across the street, and I understood. This was their counterattack. If they couldn't win in court, they'd try to destroy my credibility by making me look like a criminal. The next 6 hours in the county jail were the longest of my life. But Sarah worked fast, and by evening I was released on bail. As we walked out of the courthouse, she was furious. "This is harassment, pure and simple. They're trying to intimidate you into dropping the lawsuit." "Did it work?" I asked, surprised by my own question. She stopped and looked at me. "Miguel, that's up to you. But I need you to know something. We found the smoking gun today." My exhaustion evaporated. "What do you mean?" "While you were in jail, our private investigator found Thomas Henderson's personal journals in an estate sale. Miguel, he wrote everything down. Every family he intimidated, every illegal transaction, every threat he made, he documented his own crimes." She handed me a photocopy of a journal page dated December 20th, 1952. In Thomas Henderson's own handwriting, I read, "Ramirez finally signed today. Had to convince him with a show of force. But the Mexican understood the message. His land will make a fine addition to my holdings." The casual racism, the admission of intimidation, the complete lack of remorse, it was all there in black and white. "They just made a huge mistake arresting you," Sarah said. "Now we can add harassment and abuse of process to our lawsuit." The courthouse steps were packed with reporters and supporters as we walked out of the final mediation session. After 6 months of legal battles, media attention, and mounting evidence, the Henderson family had finally agreed to settle. Sarah carried the settlement documents in a leather briefcase, and I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. We'd won more than anyone had thought possible. The Henderson family will pay a total of $47 million in compensation to the affected families, she announced to the crowd of reporters. Additionally, they will transfer ownership of the original Ramirez property, approximately 2,400 acres, back to Miguel Ramirez and his family. The crowd erupted in cheers, but I felt strangely calm. This wasn't about the money or even about getting the land back. This was about justice for my grandfather, for all the families who'd been wronged, and for a community that had lived under the shadow of that injustice for 70 years. Maria Morales hugged me, tears streaming down her face. "My grandmother would be so proud," she whispered. Robert Johnson shook my hand firmly. "You did what none of us had the courage to do." But it was Patricia Washington's words that meant the most. "Your grandfather is finally at peace," she said. "You finished what he started." As the crowd began to disperse, I found myself standing alone on the courthouse steps, looking out at the town where I'd grown up. Everything looked the same, but I knew that everything had changed. The Henderson family's stranglehold on our community was broken, and the truth had finally come to light. I pulled out my phone and called my cousin Elena in San Antonio. "Elena, it's Miguel. We got our land back. All of it." Her scream of joy was so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. 6 months later, I stood in the same spot where Mr. Henderson had fired me. But now I was looking at my own land. The broken fence post had been replaced with a new one, and beyond it stretched 2,400 acres of Texas prairie that belonged to my family once again. The old ranch house needed work, but it was solid. Built by my great-grandfather's hands in 1923, it had weathered decades of neglect, but still stood proud against the endless sky. I'd spent the morning walking through rooms that held the ghosts of my family's history, planning the renovations that would bring it back to life. My phone buzzed with a text from Maria Morales. "Grand opening of the new dairy farm next month. You better be there." All of us had used our settlement money differently. Maria had rebuilt her grandmother's dairy operation. Robert was starting an organic cotton farm. Patricia had established a horse rescue ranch. And me? I was going to raise cattle on the land my family had always worked, but this time as owners, not employees. I walked to the old oak tree where I'd found my grandfather's hidden box and sat in the shade where he used to watch the sunrise. The metal box was gone, its secrets finally revealed, but I'd placed a small plaque at the base of the tree. Eduardo Ramirez, 1910-2018. He never stopped fighting. As the sun set over land that was finally ours again, I felt my grandfather's presence in the evening breeze. The fence was fixed, the truth was told, and justice had been served. 3 generations of wrong had been made right, and the Ramirez family was home. The fight was over. We had won.